Everybody. It's time to talk about something that we don't talk about very often. And that is going to be fear. And why are we talking about fear? Well, maybe it's because I'm dropping my first kid off at college. Maybe because I'm sitting in this beautiful apartment on the 45th floor and heights are not my favorite. There's a lot of reasons that we can be scared. And I think that, first of all, why are we afraid? And second of all, how does fear feel a little bit different in midlife? And what does fear mean in midlife? And third, how can we stop letting fear make some of our decisions? So we all experience fear. And I thought this was important to talk about because we talk about stress a lot. We talk about anxiety a lot, but we don't actually talk a lot about being scared. And it's okay to be scared. Fear is a really natural, physiologically normal emotion that we don't spend a lot of time discussing. We tend to push it down and put on our brave face. So what do we fear? Well, I fear failing all the time. Probably one of my biggest driving forces until it tips over into being not helpful anymore. We fear getting hurt. We fear making the wrong decision. We fear leaving our jobs. We fear staying in our jobs if we're not happy. We fear ending of a relationship. We fear changing relationships. We fear our kids growing up and moving on. We fear our parents getting older. All of this, getting sick, aging, all of these things can trigger this fear emotion. So what is actually fear doing for us? And is fear inhibiting us from actually doing the things that we want to do? Because it doesn't always show up when something bad might happen. It also shows up when something new might happen, right? So today, let's explore what is fear, why do we have it, what happens biologically when we're afraid, and why it might feel different for us as midlife women. And let's talk a little bit about how fear is different from anxiety and from stress. And most importantly, can we train ourselves to become less afraid? And the answer is yes, but the goal is not to eliminate fear. Fear is good and healthy, and it actually keeps us very safe, but it's deciding when fear gets a vote in our decision making. So let's start with why we have this emotion. So our brains are extraordinarily good at detecting danger, and that is important, right? So we have had this fear response. If we weren't scared of the tiger in the bushes, we probably wouldn't have survived as a species. So if you assume that the tiger is, let's look at a tiger. If you assume it's a tiger and it's actually wind making the bushes rattle, you run, you waste some energy. Not a big deal. Number two is if you assume it's the wind that's making the bush rattle and it's actually a tiger, that has much different consequences. That leads to a poor ending versus just being a little tired. So our brains evolved this way that this might be dangerous. And it's important because we still feel that today. Fear doesn't require absolute proof. In fact, it usually doesn't have absolute proof. That's kind of what leads to the resolution of our fear. But once that fear alarm goes off in our heads, our physiology starts to change really, really quickly. So our sympathetic nervous system kicks in, which that's activating our norepinephrine and adrenaline. So that causes our heart rates to increase, our blood pressure to increase, our breathing changes, right? We start to breathe a little more shallow and rapidly. Our muscles tense, our attention actually narrows, our field of vision can narrow. And we start to release glucose into our system, right? Because our body is preparing to run or flee. And so our liver starts to metabolize glycogen, and we start to release glucose to our muscles. And our brain begins to prioritize the information that is present to that threat. And so that's really important too. We tend to get very focused when we're fearful instead of having this kind of relaxed, open, curious mindset. So we are preparing to do three things: fight, run, or freeze. Not great, right? So sometimes we seek connection or safety in another person, and this is incredibly effective. But our nervous system wasn't designed for our calendars. It wasn't designed for our inboxes. It wasn't designed for our career transition. It wasn't designed for dropping a kid off at college, which I did this morning. Our fear that isn't designed to help us, our fear response, I should say, isn't designed to help us figure out if we're doing enough with our lives. It was designed to keep us alive. And so there are times where fear is mistaken physiologically with uncertainty as if we were in danger. So what's actually happening in our brain? So we hear a lot that the amygdala is the fear center of our brain. And that's useful, but let's go a little bit deeper. So fear involves this entire neural network, and the amygdala helps detect and learn that emotional significance of threat. The hippocampus helps us provide kind of context and structure around the fearful event. Have I done this? Have I been in this situation before? What happened? Where did it happen? Was this situation actually dangerous? And is the same situation I'm in dangerous like the previous one? Or is it just similar? And then our prefrontal cortex, right, that helps us regulate executive function, that interprets and contextualizes our responses. So if you're about to give an important presentation and your threat detection system goes off and says, this could go really, really wrong, could go bad. And our body responds, right? Heart rate goes up. We start to get a little sweaty and clammy. Vision narrows and you start to feel a little maybe lightheaded, some butterflies in our stomach. But then can you have another part of your brain examine the situation that you're in? And this is a key concept. Wait, I am not actually in physical danger. I've prepared. I've done this before. And this sensation doesn't mean that I can't do it. So that ability to contextualize fear is really important for the strategies we use to be able to handle fear and deal with it in a really positive way. When something happens that is dangerous, our brain associates that with danger and it remembers. And so, but your brain can also learn safety, right? And this process is often called fear extinction or inhibitory learning. And that becomes really important when we talk about how we overcome fear. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how we use the word fear versus anxiety versus stress, because today we use a lot of these words interchangeably. They are related, but they're not identical. Here's the simplest way to think about something. Fear says there's a threat. It doesn't really matter what that threat is. The dog's running towards me. The car's going towards the cliff. Someone is threatening me. It tends to be pretty immediate. Anxiety says there might be a threat. Is this presentation going to go badly? What if something happens to my child? What if the stomach ache is really something serious? But it's more of an anticipation than an actual threat. And stress is the demands on me are exceeding or threatening to exceed my resources. There's too much of this, too many deadlines. There's not enough of this, not enough sleep, not enough connection, not enough money. I'm overwhelmed caring for children and aging parents while working. My relationships are fractured. So stress can amplify anxiety. Stress can be impacted by fear. So anxiety, stress, and fear all activate that same sympathetic part of our nervous system. So it can feel very similar, right? Anxiety, we can use some of the same tools as fear, which is to contextualize, to teach our brain safety, to use relaxation techniques. Chronic activation can actually make our threat detection system more sensitive. So that's that chronic stress. If we are chronically under stress, chronically under stress, not under stressed. If we are chronically under stress, we tend to become more fearful of things because that sympathetic nervous system is in overload. So let's talk about midlife and why we might feel different in midlife. There's a narrative that is sometimes associated for women in midlife that suddenly we're too emotional, we're less resilient, and that everything can be explained by hormones. And we know we talk a lot about this on this podcast, and those things are definitely not true. And that's probably an overly simplified version of what's going on. But our hormones do interact with our brain systems involved in stress, emotion, and fear learning. And so it's important to recognize that. We've talked about this a lot, that estrogen receptors are distributed throughout the different regions of our brain. And when we start to lose estrogen, that impacts these different centers of the brain differently. So research has shown that women across different hormonal states, that estrogen can really influence fear and learning, in particular, that fear extinction, the brain's ability to learn that we're actually safe. And that something that was previously related with danger may not be actually continue to be related with danger. So during perimenopause, when estrogen starts to fluctuate pretty significantly, women can have these changes that we've already talked about: increased anxiety, changes in sleep, changes in mood. So biologically, when we lose estrogen's kind of protective effect and ability to influence the parts of our brain that helps us process fear and contextualize fear, we're also changing psychologically because, as we've talked about a gazillion times, and we'll continue to talk about, this is such an active period of change in a woman's life. And so we have a lot of non-physical things going on as well, right? We are often in this sandwich of caring for children that are maybe leaving home and starting their own lives while we're caring for aging parents. And that relationship with our parents can be changing quite a bit, where we're becoming more of a caregiver. And instead of feeling cared for, our relationships change. We could start to struggle with our partners because of all of the other associated changes. And we have to really rediscover what those relationships look like. And our careers might be peaking or might be at a point where they're just not as satisfying. And so we're looking to make a career change. And when we look at the statistics about how many midlife women, it's the highest growing number of new businesses are coming from midlife women. So where do we really want to go as our bodies are changing, our recovery is changing, our sleep is changing, and how does that impact our ability to handle fear? And so sometimes we start thinking, am I too old to do this? What if I fail at this point? When I'm 20, if I make a bad decision, I feel like I have a lot of time to make up for it. If I make a bad decision at 50, what's that impact going to be? So maybe I shouldn't change jobs. Maybe it's too late to start something new. Maybe I shouldn't travel alone. Maybe I should just stay in this relationship. And so we start to have fear take over some of these decisions. One, because we don't have as much estrogen. Two, because so much change is going on around us that sometimes feels out of our control. So we have to decide, is this really dangerous? And do I need to be fearful, or is this uncomfortable? And we can overcome both of these things, but we can also get comfortable being uncomfortable a little bit. So let's talk about what happens when we actually avoid fear. Avoidance can reinforce the fear. So if we continue to not do something that we are afraid of, giving a talk, speaking in public, maybe doing a challenge that we don't feel 100% prepared for. The more we don't do those things, our brain gets reinforced that was scary, I didn't do it, and now I'm safe. So let's go back to public speaking, because I think this is a really common example and people can relate to this. If you're terrified of public speaking and you're invited to give a talk, you say no. You immediately feel relief from that, and your brain learns something. Not that public speaking is safe, but instead, thank goodness we got away from that. Thank goodness we escaped that threat. And so next time you're asked to speak, that fear might even be greater because you just enhance that feeling of safety by saying no the last time. So as we start to experience fear and fear of the same thing, when we start to overcome that, the brain learns safety. But if we don't do it that way, then we reinforce that fear flywheel, for lack of a better word, and we become more and more fearful of that. So this is the kind of foundation for what we call exposure-based training. And this does not mean if you're afraid of public speaking, that all of a sudden you sign up to speak in front of 2,000 people. This is slow, deliberate exposure to something. And it's very gradual, like a lot of the things that we do. So this is like enhancing the neuroplasticity around some of these areas. This is designed to create a new learning for our brains, a learning that this activity that I am fearful of, or this decision that I am fearful of, is actually safe. So the goal isn't, I'm never going to be afraid of this. The goal is I can feel fear and discover that the outcome my brain predicted doesn't necessarily happen. Okay. And that's profoundly different. So how do we work through this fear? What do I actually do? One, we have to put a name on the fear. What am I afraid of? Not I'm stressed out about work, or I feel anxious about this kind of vague thing. We need to specifically say, I'm afraid if I leave this job, I am going to fail at the next one. I'm afraid if I leave this job, I'm not going to be able to support my family in the way that I need to. So when we can specifically name it, it's much easier to address. Fear, the emotion, loves these vague, ambiguous situations. It grows in those situations. If we can narrow it down of what we're truly scared of and put a name on it, then we can start to address it. The other thing we have to do is separate, again, fear from discomfort. Am I actually unsafe versus am I uncomfortable? And I think in today's world, we tend to be more uncomfortable than actually unsafe. So there are situations when fear is providing valuable information. You're walking down the street and someone is following you. Pretty important to be fearful. You're in a car that's going too fast. Okay to be fearful. We don't want to necessarily override that. Fear is providing really great information. But there are situations that are limiting us that aren't dangerous. They're uncertain. Giving the talk in public, making a different choice. They are uncertain. They can make us feel vulnerable. They can make us feel uncomfortable. and it produces the same sensation of fear, but we have much more agency over those situations than we do the truly dangerous ones. So let's identify the prediction. Fear is usually making a prediction. If I do X, Y will happen. If I speak up, I'll embarrass myself. If I try a new sport, I'll fail. If I set a boundary, they'll be angry. If I leave this job, I'm going to regret it. So write it down, right? Because now you've turned this emotion into a hypothesis, and a hypothesis can be tested. So let's take a small, meaningful step toward it, not away from fear, toward it. So if public speaking, again, we're going to go back to this because it's such a good example to use. Like we talked about, you're not going to start with a keynote in front of thousands of people. Maybe you start with asking a question in a meeting, especially in a room that you feel safe. Maybe you lead the meeting the next time, or instead of delegating someone to present for you, you do the presentation. Maybe it's 10 people and then it's 20 and you become more confident. And I think also asking for feedback in those situations, because we tend to be our own worst critics. When we think something has gone terrible, it's actually gone pretty well. So all of a sudden, you've now told your brain a very different message. You've told your brain, I did this and I was safe on the other side. Nothing bad happened. And you've learned to overcome that feeling of danger. And then we need to stay in this long enough to learn something. So the goal isn't simply making the uncomfortable feeling disappear. Modern exposure science emphasizes inhibitory learning. So you need to build a competing memory. My brain predicted danger and I discovered another possible outcome. And you can create stronger and stronger evidence that your brain can handle the situation. And then we got to practice. We got to repeat this in different areas because fear learning is contextual, right? So if something you can do comfortably with your best friend may still terrify you in front of your boss. So, right, there's a context around our fear. And so something that we see this in athletes all the time, something that you can do in practice that feels really comfortable feels very different in competition. So we have to repeat. We have to try things in different situations. We have to continue to put ourselves in different environments, and we have to have different levels of difficulty, right? So let's take, for example, an athletic competition. You've trained for it and you might feel really comfortable in your home environment training, but when you show up on competition day, you feel that nervousness. You fear, maybe that fear of failure is coming into your mind. And so if we learn to keep challenging, the lessons travel with us. So we can show up in different environments. We can do things at different levels of difficulty. And that doesn't mean we don't have a little bit of anxiety and stress and maybe a little bit of fear. Again, we're not trying to eliminate fear. We're trying to harness that energy and use it in a positive direction and create a safe context around it. So some questions to think about this week as we finish up here. What am I not doing because I'm afraid? I want you guys to ask yourselves a few questions and then ask, so what am I not doing because I'm afraid? And then what exactly am I afraid will happen? And write it down. Write it down. See what happens. And finally, is that fear protecting me from danger or protecting me from discomfort? Because again, those are two different things. And courage is not the absence of fear, but courage is becoming better at interpreting our fear. Fear says pay attention. It doesn't necessarily say stop what you're doing. So we can look back at our lives. I guarantee you there's all a situation that we've been fearful of. Maybe we've failed, but we've recovered and moved on. Maybe we've lost things. We've rebuilt. And maybe we've done things we thought we couldn't do. But instead of asking, how do I stop being afraid? Maybe we say, how do I become someone who can move forward while fear comes along for the ride? And fear can sit next to you. Like some of our emotions, we don't put them in the closet. We know they're there and we can acknowledge it when it serves us. And our biology does create the alarm, but we can decide what happens next. We can decide if it's danger or discomfort, and we can decide how much control we want that fear to have over our decision making. So thanks again for joining us. This has been a fun conversation, especially for me, who's been having a lot of fear lately with some changes going on. And I hope you guys have a great day. Talk soon.
Thank you so much for spending your time with us here today. If you liked what you heard and you got some tips on how to live better right now and for the long haul, please help us reach more midlife women. Please share and rate and like this show. And we can't wait to continue the dialogue with you on our next episode. Until then, thank you. It's time.